Swadee Krap. Hello, good morning, everyone, our viewers, and good morning, Swadee Krap, Kun Kavi. My name is Thitinan Pongsotirak. I am I'm a lecturer at the Chulalongkorn University's Faculty of Political Science, but also director of the Institute for Security and International Studies at the Faculty of Political Science. Today is our debut, first time that ASEANUS Thailand is doing a Facebook streaming, live streaming. It's taken us a few weeks to adjust to this lockdown period. The coronavirus has impacted all kinds of people across the world, and universities, classes, and so have we been affected as well. So this is the first time. I want to first say that I want to apologize, first of all, for any technical glitches that we will likely have today. I want to thank the team at ASEANUS Thailand, first of all, and I also want to thank Kun Kavi for being our first guest on the show. We will have a series of events like this, webcasts, this Friday, the following Friday, and Friday afterwards. We have several during this period where most of us are staying at home or working from home. Today, we have our first webcast, and the topic is ASEAN and the novel coronavirus, also called the COVID-19, so-called. We're looking at this as a kind of an ASEAN issue. Kun Kavi and I will have a dialogue, trading notes and exchanging ideas and views for the first 45 minutes or so, but we want to take questions and comments. So you may post questions and comments to asesthailand@gmail.com during this time, and somehow it will get relayed to me. And please do state your name and your institutional affiliation. We would do this very much like we do at the in-person public forum that we've had on campus on a regular basis. So I'm used to this in-person kind of events. We've had very good turnouts on all kinds of issues, basically looking at Thailand from the outside world, looking at the outside world from Thailand, all kinds of issues. So in those events, people would raise their hands and they would get up and they would ask questions, post comments. So we can do that here online. Everything is online now, it seems. But please do state your name and your institutional affiliation, and then please keep your questions and comments concise so that we can take more of them. If there are no questions, no comments, that's okay. Kun Kavi and I have plenty of material to discuss about ASEAN and COVID-19. So on that note, this is, again, kind of a first time. I'm looking at the screens. There's a lot of alphabet here. There's a keyboard here. I'm not seeing any of the viewers, but never mind. This is how it works, obviously, evidently. Let me invite now Kun Kavi on the screen, if I can ask our technicians to help us with that. Kun Kavi, Swadee Krap, another time. Kun Kavi Jongkitawon has been with ASEAN issues, has been studying, writing, analyzing, speaking about ASEAN for 40 years. He's a lifelong ASEAN specialist, analyst. I also have known Kun Kavi for 30 years. And in those years, initially we began as journalists at the Nation newspaper, but subsequently I went into academia, but we remain in close touch. Kun Kavi is also a senior fellow with ASEANUS Thailand, with Institute of Security and International Studies at Chulalongkorn University. So welcome, Kun Kavi, as our first guest. I think there's a bit of a delay. I understand there's a 20-second delay. So we'll just get used to it, I think. So to launch into our topic today, ASEAN and COVID-19. If I could ask our technicians to just bring up a few charts we've prepared, we can see that this is a combined number for for ASEAN, Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia, as you know, is a region. ASEAN is a regional organization, and COVID-19 has been consequential. I mean, adversely consequential for ASEAN. And you can see this graph, combined numbers, very worrying for ASEAN as a whole. In this environment so far, and you know, this is a global situation. Every country is handling this on its own, by itself, for its own sake. But I think for Southeast Asia, we will have to start thinking about COVID-19 as a regional situation, as a regional problem. And Khun Kavi, can we start off just saying how what's your take on COVID-19 and ASEAN? Are we seeing enough of a regional cooperation to address this in the longer term, medium term, or is it still too much the case of every country for itself?
While it's starting, as you know, Ajahn Thitinan, it takes some time ASEAN to start something like this big, especially a pandemic. And I think in the past, to be exact, about 60 days now, ASEAN has been working non-stop since they held their first video conference amongst ASEAN foreign minister among themselves to set up the work plan. This is something big. Once ASEAN get the consensus going, it will proceed. As you know, in the past 2 months, there have been several, almost a dozen senior official meeting involved with, for example, Ministry of Defense, Tourism, Public Health, and economic related agency try to work out future plans. As you know, ASEAN Summit has been postponed to at the end of June, but ASEAN leaders has planned to hold a scheduled teleconference on the 14th of April to work out a more specific plan to make sure that ASEAN will fight the COVID-19 as a group, original plan, you know, as a group. Of course, when it start out, as you point out, each country has to focus on their own problems. And ASEAN is a very diverse group, so each country has its own public health systems, units, and agencies. Now, I think with all the senior officials getting together, organizing themselves, now I think the leaders will have a final say. I think on the 14th of April, you will see something more concrete. Dr. Thitinan.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to show a couple more charts. You know, so far, as of yesterday, 592 people died from COVID-19 in Southeast Asia, including 280 in Indonesia, 203 in Philippines, 67 in Malaysia, 32 in Thailand, and altogether 3,614 people have recovered. So that's quite promising as well. I mean, there's a lot of recoveries, but the death toll is climbing. If I could ask our technicians to show this graph here, you can see the four main countries. Can we see the previous chart, please? Yeah, so this is a rising death toll, and something that we have to kind of very much worry about. Indonesia, the slope is steeper. Thailand, the slope is not as steep, but compared to the global figures, Thailand is very worried about its own results. We will hear Thailand has a kind of a everyday, midday announcement of the latest numbers, the latest casualties. So for the two countries, I think we worry within the ASEAN context is Indonesia and Philippines. ASEAN, as you know, has a lot of people. I think we correct me if I'm wrong, about 650 million people, and every day, of course, the number goes up, and we have, you know, nearly $2 trillion GDP altogether. The onus and the kind of existential challenge for ASEAN is that this is a regional organization that has succeeded in providing a platform, in playing a bridging role for the Asian region. ASEAN has gone through different phases, the thick and thin of the Cold War. Initially, it was divided. So, if you look at the ASEAN history, it's come a very long way in 52 years. But now, in the latest phase, in the current phase, ASEAN is relying on being a community, a production base, an internal market for tourism, for trade investment, for FDI, for supply chains. COVID-19 is, I think, to me, an existential challenge to ASEAN because it could undo and upend a lot of the ASEAN achievements. I mean, if supply chains are disrupted and derailed, no longer the same, this will change the ASEAN attraction. ASEAN cannot attract all this FDI and to use ASEAN as a kind of a production hub and also a large market as well. So if COVID-19 gets out of control, if it spirals out of control, for the region, and it goes back and forth, it stays around the region for some time, an indefinite period, this means that, the ASEAN achievements and attraction as a kind of a architecture building, a driver for regional cooperation, for peace and stability, and also for growth and development. This narrative will also be disrupted if the ASEAN success story is undermined by COVID-19. So if you go back to the chart, if you go to the second chart, numbers rising that tall, but now the chart, please. The third chart that we prepared shows mortality rates. So, as of yesterday, Indonesia had more cases, 337 new cases for a total of 3,293, 3,293. Philippines increased by 206, and bringing the total to 4,076, 4,076. Malaysia has been seeing more testing than the other ASEAN countries, and the overall number is therefore higher, 4,228. Thailand added just 54 yesterday to 2,423, 2,423. So one issue that we have, is the death rate, the mortality rate. Myanmar has low infections, but very high death toll, very high mortality rate. Thailand lower, but there's a question whether Thailand is going through enough testing. Singapore has been at the forefront in managing the COVID crisis from the beginning. And if you look at Asia, East Asia, China was the first to go through it, and apparently has kind of come out of it, re-emerged. South Korea, Japan is grappling with some spikes now. But South Korea and Taiwan has been also an exemplary country, kind of a poster country for how to deal with this from the outset. In contrast to China, on the one hand, China, a huge giant country, successful, effective in containing, controlling, and stabilizing COVID crisis. But Taiwan, as a kind of a democratic country, smaller country, also has been successful since January in containing, controlling, stabilizing the COVID crisis. For ASEAN, as you can see the numbers, we have a lot to worry about. I think this is just the beginning. And we also not seeing cases in Laos. I think there have been a report of a handful of infections. And, there's a lot of question marks about the situation in Laos, Myanmar, of course, and then Cambodia. What I'm afraid of, Kun Kavi, suppose that Thailand can bring this under control in the near term, let's say within the next, medium term, 4 to 6 weeks, and maybe by mid-2020, we can see some semblance of a new normal. Maybe schools, universities can be reopened, and some restaurants and hotels and so on. But then the risk will be that the returning workers, the migrant workers from Laos, Cambodia, and Myanmar, if those countries do not have the means, the health care system to deal effectively with COVID crisis, then the migrant workers from those countries can come into Thailand, because Thailand need migrant workers from those countries for the Thai economy. They're really the backbone now. So they can come back and infect again, and infect the Thai market, the Thai economy. So Thailand can see infections returning just by having migrant workers from those countries, and that's why I think somehow this has to be seen in a regional context. It's not just a country on its own, because ASEAN relies on its neighbors within ASEAN to make itself individual countries attractive, because the region has to be attractive. So what do you think that, if I may ask you, I know that you are much more in tune with the ASEAN track one, the kinds of the meetings that they're having, the officials and the senior officials and so on. Do you see collective responses in the pipeline coming from the officials? And the ASEAN summit is being postponed now. The next summit, I think the senior officials probably preparing a lot of statements and positions. What can we expect, from as an ASEAN response to this COVID crisis?
First of all, I'd like to respond to your first concern about migrant workers from our neighboring countries. As you correctly point out, some of them have left Thailand. But a few days ago, Thailand has passed a special law saying that those who have contact COVID-19, please stay in Thailand. We will take care of you. Because Thailand realized that if they return, along the way, they will infect people who come close to them. So I think that is the biggest concern for the Thai. And at the moment, as you know, Thailand has around 55 border checkpoints with Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. We are not counting Malaysia in this case. So they have you have the so-called public health volunteers who have monitors, making sure that those who go in and out at the moment, which have a lot of restriction, making sure that they're free of virus. So hopefully, when things return, as you describe as a new normal, we will have test kit and others tools that will be able to measures to check migrant workers who decided to return to work. And I think track 2 levels also NGO are working closely together also. It's because they have also their agenda. But for track 1, one of the most difficult thing is, as you point out earlier, that ASEAN is the hub of the global value chains. We have to maintain that. Otherwise, economy of Southeast Asia will just drop dead. We need to work out a system so that our global value chain continue. We have to rebuild this because it has been somehow destroyed. Number 2, we have to make sure that our ASEAN connectivity will remain intact. The government have to put focus on connectivity. Now, people-to-people connectivities, because of COVID-19, has become a top priority. And this is something that ASEAN need to work together. And I think number 3, ASEAN has to mobilize funds. If certain member country need some extra funds, responsive COVID-19 fund, I think they're still working out. The officials still have to come out with a specific plan. So these are something in the pipeline, Dr. Thitinan.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I mean, you mentioned funding and also the economies of ASEAN. moving forward, I think beyond this is a multi-layered crisis, Kunkavi. I mean, we have a public health crisis, of course, at the outset. This is a situation where you have to kind of arrest and contain the spread, the outbreak of coronavirus. But then after the public health crisis is dealt with, we can see now, like in Thailand, for example, and also in Singapore, we're seeing huge, massive economic bailout packages. In Thailand, the government has announced 1.9 trillion baht, 1.9 trillion baht of a rescue package, and that's the equivalent of 11% of GDP. I mean, Singapore also has announced massive rescue package, even more than Thailand. And I'm just wondering now that, in all the ASEAN economies this year, we can look at contractions. I mean, we have to face up to it. We will see economic contractions. Economies will contract around the region. Certainly a recession. And the last time, Kunkavi, that we've seen this kind of a ravaging economic impact was in 1997, 1998. When it was region-wide, when we required external rescue packages for Thailand and Indonesia from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. This time, the IMF is not going to be that kind of lender of last resort. So these economies have to help themselves, and if they can't help each other, that would be even better. But I'm just a little bit concerned now going forward that Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar, when we have recession in ASEAN, how do individual economies deal with it? First of all, and second, in 2 decades ago, a bit over 2 decades ago, the IMF, of course, lent a hand, but also Japan tried to help. Initially we had an idea of setting up even an Asian monetary fund back then in the late 1990s, but it didn't come off the ground. But this time, the big lender of last resort, could that be China? Would this be an opportunity now, an occasion where China moves in to make further inroads into ASEAN because it can provide that kind of funding, it can provide that kind of cushion to underpin economic recovery in the region. Kunkavi, what do you think on these two issues?
I think fundings-wise, ASEAN has to rely on the so-called ASEAN plus 3. ASEAN will not put the egg in one basket for sure. In this case, China. Definitely, China has expressed the readiness to help ASEAN at the very beginning. You could remember when ASEAN foreign minister met with Wang Yi, Chinese foreign minister, last month in Vientiane. China actually has offered to host the leader summit between ASEAN and China to work out future program to help each other. One of the idea China has proposed, which ASEAN is now studying, is to have a stockpile of PPEs of medicine, just in case of future pandemic. ASEAN member can draw from these stockpiles. But this idea is now under consideration. I think it will take some time. Regarding the funding, it's very interesting. I think ASEAN will try to tap on the Chiang Mai initiative, multilaterals, the money that they have, maybe just 10%, and there are other financed under the different mechanism under ASEAN plus 3. I think, Ajahn Titinan, you will see ASEANs try to engage ASEAN plus 3. At the moment, China, Japan, and South Korea are working together. Their relations have improved tremendously during this crisis. The people have shown sympathy to each other, encourage each other to combat the COVID-19. And I think ASEAN will take this opportunity to further strengthen ASEAN plus 3 in all dimensions. And one more point, It's very important that ASEAN come out strongly that they must promote free trade. This is a very important because you have this kind of domestic problem, recession. There will be some certain policy maker would like to advocate some sort of protectionist measure or nationalist sentiment. I think ASEAN has to think as a regional organization, and I think this is very important. I will carefully watch and see what ASEAN leader would do in the future.
Thank you. That's pretty much the same line of thinking. I have been keeping a tab on Asian relations, where the intersection of geopolitics and geoeconomics. This is a crisis where I think that countries that emerge out of it sooner will have an advantage. So, for example, China is coming out of it and trying to resume life now, resume its economy, opening up again. And at the same time, Kun Kui, the United States is deep in crisis. The United States is deep in crisis. It already had a kind of a polarization crisis, very divided country. But now with the COVID crisis, the US has a public health disaster on its hands. The different states are having to deal with it. New York has suffered a lot. I think there's been lockdowns in many states in the US, many areas. So the infections are going up. The outbreak is getting worse. The US now has the highest number of infections, whereas China has kind of stabilized. This is something I think we also are seeing, not just the intersection of geopolitics, geoeconomics, but also geohealth, geomedical, and geopolitics. You mentioned Northeast Asia. This is a new situation. Normally, we would see tension and rivalry between China and Japan, Kun Kawi. China and Japan. But this time, China and Japan actually they kind of aligned in dealing with COVID. Even from the beginning, from the outset, when China was going through this in January, February, you remember the lockdown in the Wuhan, and the country was, many parts of China were in lockdown when most of the rest of the world was still going on about its business. Back then, Japan actually supported, at least lent some support to China. So we're seeing this ASEAN plus 3 context turning in a positive way under the COVID light, during the COVID crisis. In fact, there's been more cooperation, even though historically a lot of enmity between US and China, between Japan and China, and then also with Japan, Korea. So I would agree with you that I think ASEAN plus 3 is really the context for assistance and coordination, cooperation with ASEAN that ASEAN should be looking at. At the same time, I also wonder now, with the U.S. Having so much on its plate now, election year, President Trump is, they also have launched another massive bailout package. I think to the tune of 2.2 trillion US dollars. Nothing like this has been seen. Even 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. I don't think it was this scale and this with this suddenness. So, are we seeing kind of a drift here? I mean, ASEAN, ideally would look to Europe, would look to the US, would look to Northeast Asia, China, in a kind of a balancing fashion. But I think now China is making more inroads. But maybe Japan can provide a bit of a counterweight for ASEAN. At the same time that Japan, China may be reaching or may have reached a new kind of working normal for them. Kun Kiwi, what do you think?
Well, I think it depends on major powers how they would like to play the so-called geostrategic brinksmanship with ASEAN. For the time being, I must say that ASEAN plus 3 relations are excellent, and the future it will be even more strengthened because of the mutual cooperation. Of course, ASEAN relations with the United States are solid because I think former President Barack Obama has created a kind of strong foundation for ASEAN and United States to proceed. Unfortunately, President Trump, in his last few months, still have not yet cemented good rapport with ASEAN relations. So we have not seen any extraordinary that come out from ASEAN-US relation under Trump. In fact, the Las Vegas scheduled meeting, which was postponed, supposed to be the highlight of ASEAN-US relation under Trump. But since it was postponed, America under Trump could not announce its new initiative for the ASEAN, particularly for the Mekong region, which is something really on the top agendas for the United States. United States want to announce new funding development plans for Mekong. I don't think now is possible. So in the future, I think you will see ASEAN will strengthen cooperation with ASEAN plus 3. And I will predict that there will be a lot more talk about building the so-called East Asia community, something, that we were familiar 30 years ago. But now the possibility is there because you have ASEAN plus 3 working together and people-to-people relations are much stronger. So I think that is the outlook, pretty good for ASEAN plus 3. But first of all, we must make sure that we mitigate the spread of the virus, we take care of each other, and then we can move on to promote other aspect relation that will strengthen further.
Okay, thank you. ASEAN plus 3, of course, is 10 plus 10 ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, and South Korea, Republic of Korea. It does not include India, Australia, New Zealand, which is within the ASEAN plus 6, or the used to be called used to be within the East Asia Summit, but then East Asia Summit now also has included the United States and Russia. So there are a number of major countries, Kunkawi, that are not within the ASEAN plus 3. I do agree that this crisis, at some point when we get beyond it, it will give some impetus for East Asian regionalization, contingent on China-Japan relations, on Japan-South Korea, and on the whole Northeast Asia situation. If that can be kept on track and cordial and cooperative, then I think that would be a big boost for ASEAN plus 3 framework. At the same time, I think that there are still issues. I've been keeping an eye on the China-ASEAN issues, Kunkawi. South China Sea, the Philippines and Vietnam have a number of issues, contentious issues with China, especially Vietnam. The Philippines under Duterte has, of course, turned around and sought support and cooperation with China, and I think that relationship has moved a bit much closer, I think. But Vietnam is still a country very much in the mix that has still a lot of contentious issues, a lot of friction with China. So this COVID crisis, Northeast Asia, ASEAN plus 3, of course, the framework now looks much more relevant, much more promising in terms of addressing this crisis and moving beyond it. But how does it play with the incumbent existing friction that ASEAN has had with China in the South China Sea, for example?
Well, it is very interesting. The Vietnam chair tries to make sure that second reading of the first draft complete this year as planned. But of course, there's still some minor details that both China and ASEAN has to work out on this code of conduct. Vietnam, as a chair this year, has been very active in promote cooperation regarding the COVID-19, especially with ASEAN plus 3. With China, they have been helping each other, with Japan, with South Korea. And this is one of the most important, I would say, mission now. Because when Vietnam assumed the chair, it came out with 5 objectives, deliverable, that will promote ASEAN cohesiveness and responsiveness. But now suddenly the pandemic came about, and it has become the single most important mission now that will show that ASEAN really is cohesive and responsive. If Vietnam failed in organizing collectively or ASEAN's led mechanism, then its chairmanship would be a failure. So Vietnam has now focused all its effort to promote in all aspects of ASEAN-led COVID-19 together with other dialogue countries. Certainly, I focus on plus 3. Other dialogue countries are also very important. You have EU, as you mentioned, we have Australia, you have Russia, New Zealand, which are also having dialogue with ASEAN. So I think ASEAN will welcome multiple nations help from all the dialogue country. But under Vietnam currently, I think Vietnam want to make sure that ASEAN emerge from this COVID-19 crisis a stronger ASEAN, stronger centrality, strong cohesiveness, and responsiveness that is swift and fast. Ajahn Thitinan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just thinking, that if you look at the East Asia Summit framework, Kunkawi, this is ASEAN plus 3, plus Australia, New Zealand, and India, and then plus United States and Russia. So, these 18 countries, but we're seeing India grappling with the COVID crisis and having a hard time. We're also seeing the United States having a very hard time. I wonder, this seems to me that the COVID crisis will change the complexion of the EAS, the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit, will be affected by the COVID crisis because some countries will suffer more than others. Some countries will emerge or recover faster than others. Some countries will have a certain kind of assistance and help than others and so on. So I'm just thinking that India having a problem, United States having its own kind of crisis from COVID. This is a time where I think China, Japan can really not take over, but assert both roles in the East Asia framework, and it gets back to the ASEAN plus 3. So I think the ASEAN plus 3 frame, this has come up since 1998, by the way. 1998, ASEAN plus 3, Kunkawi, you'll remember that it was a response to the Asian financial crisis, right? It was a way of trying to regionalize, Asianize within East Asia, a response to that crisis. So this may be a second chance, another occasion, or maybe it's ASEAN plus 3 2.0, Kunkawi.
Interesting. I think ASEAN will have to take the lead. That's the only way. Otherwise, other dialogue partner might not be happy. You mentioned India. As you know, throughout the past year, Thailand, Vietnam, currently chairman of ASEAN, tries to persuade India and makes a conducive conditions so that India can join the RCEP. But at the moment, given the domestic necessity and other issue, I think has become much more difficult for India to do so. But I think in the future, EAS, the so-called East Asia Summit, will become more important in discuss issue of emergency. As you know, in the past, American has complained all the time that EAS has been too bureaucratic. They fail to discuss issues of immediacy or emergency. I remember covered the meetings in Naypyidaw. Former President Obama complained. He wanted to raise the Ebola crisis, but ASEAN did not discuss as such. But I think, as you point out, COVID-19 will really unifies all the EAS member. That is a number one emergency issue, pandemic that all EAS member have to discuss and come out with an action plans.
Okay. Let me take a different point of view on the EAS and COVID. But before I go into that, I want to just say to our viewers, and I'm very curious who they are because I have no idea. I can't see anyone except just you and me, Kun Kavi. Please, if you have questions and comments, include your name, institutional affiliation, and please send them to the isisthailand@gmail.com. One word, isisthailand@gmail.com. You can also post your questions and comments on ISIS Thailand Facebook Messenger, and we will be looking at the questions and comments shortly. I want to engage the audience as much as possible. Just to go back to your note about the East Asia Summit, Kun Kavi. So one question we could pose is this: I mean, what are the consequences? What is the longer term impact of COVID-19 on the East Asia Summit? So, in my view, let's take a look at India. So, India's unwillingness or inability to sign on to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, to me, that already kind of distant India from ASEAN, right? I mean, RCEP is really an ASEAN platform. Of course, it has other countries in it with the +3, of course, but Australia, New Zealand as well. But without India, I mean, this is really, I think, inhibiting India's geopolitical projection in Southeast Asia. I mean, if India wants to have an Act East geostrategy and it doesn't join the RCEP, that would be a major impediment. But now with COVID, I think it's going to compound that distance because, without RCEP and now with COVID that India has to struggle with, so India, I think, has a lot to think about in its relations with ASEAN. Now, in the EAS frame, I'm just thinking United States, the US, having its own crisis at home. It's also election year, and the Trump administration, we've seen the trade war with China and the technology war. I call it a non-military war, really, before COVID. And when this eventually reaches a new normal, some stability, I wonder if the US will still be within the East Asia Summit. I wonder how it will perceive, and want to interact with the East Asia Summit countries. So it could be the case that, Kun Kavi, COVID might be the variable, the crisis that not divide, but perhaps creating some differences and distances among the East Asia Summit partners. Maybe closer for China, Japan, South Korea, but maybe a bit more distance for India and maybe for United States. And the countries in between would be Australia. And Australia has been, has been kind of tough on China. And if Australia is tough on China and China is very close or closer to Southeast Asia, this might be consequential for Australia. New Zealand I see as in between, and New Zealand is having its own lockdown and trying to arrest once and for all in the near term the COVID crisis. And I think New Zealand is a bit more hedged. So, I think it has not gone so far to the front vis-a-vis China, like Australia. So New Zealand might be in a position to triangulate or, multi-angulate between Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, and North America. Might be in a bit more of a position to have some flexibility and pragmatism going forward. Australia might be more like US, India on the other side. We haven't talked about Russia yet, but we can already see, Kunkawi, that the COVID crisis is having far-reaching ramifications for Indo-Pacific issues, framework, Asia-Pacific prosperity framework, and we might. In fact, I wonder if this is only the onset. We might not even be at the middle of the COVID crisis yet. So there's a lot more to come, but we can see some trends already at this point.
So I think ASEAN has to maintain as a bridge. As you mentioned, ASEAN has been able to balance relation in the past 52 years, with all major power. Sometimes it has better cooperation with China, with US, with Australia, with New Zealand, with Russia. Russia becomes strategic partner of ASEAN, mind you. So you have witnessed ASEAN's abilities to adapt and to adjust its relation to make sure ASEAN will never allow major power to dominate their relation. I think ASEAN know this full well, particularly AAS. And I think ASEAN from now on has to retool or reconsider ASEAN's outlook in Indo-Pacific. I think it's important to put more focus on the public health issue. And this is something that Indonesia, Thailand, or other ASEAN member has to revise, because this is a live document. So this is something that ASEAN can work for. I think in the future, EAS will become a very important leaders strategic forum. And I think all the countries that are a dialogue partner will engage. And if EU has been able to overcome difficulty with certain ASEAN member, then EU would be welcome to join EAS for sure. But it will take some time, Dr. Titina.
Okay, thank you. We're going to continue our conversation on COVID-19 and ASEAN, Kunkawi, but there are a bunch of, we have a lot of questions and comments. I want to integrate some questions and comments along the way. We have up until 11 a.m. So we have, this is a time, I'm sorry to be looking at the phone now. This is a time where in an audience, in person, I will be looking for hands, show of hands up for questions and comments, but now we have no hands. We have messages from this messenger and line and so on. So I'll have to be looking at this and the screen back and forth. Let's take a couple of questions and comments. First from Judy Ben. Judy Ben was the executive director of American Chamber of Commerce in Thailand. She has relocated back to the US. She has posed this question, Kunkawi. As the US has concentrated on our ongoing domestic disaster with what appears little global leadership, China has seemed to step up its global support. Could this be the shift of global leadership between US and China? So global leadership, US-China, from Judy Ben. I have Johanna Sond, also someone who has studied and analyzed and followed ASEAN. Please, I forget the institutional affiliation. So please, for our viewers, please also, apart from your name, tell us your institutional affiliation so we can kind of create and foster a community of track 2, 1.5, and track 3 from this kind of dialogue. Johannesson asks, what ASEAN-led COVID-19 mechanism is shaping up? We read Vietnam meeting with different dialogue partners, and Singapore, Indonesia seem to have played a role in the recent UN resolution. But operationally, even in assistance to ASEAN nationals, there does not seem to be much on an everyday life level. So let's take these two questions first. I mean, Judy Ben's question, I think, is very much a posit apropos to the conversation about China-US global leadership. Johannes-san's point and question is something I want to dig deeper into a little bit, Kunkawi. There's not been, even at basic levels, like the immigration, I have encountered issues whereby European nationals are marooned or kind of stuck and trying to go home from different ASEAN countries, and there's been very little, if any, ASEAN coordination in providing flights home for these European nationals. So even at that basic level, I think there's been lacking. They've been lacking in coordination and cooperation. But beyond that, I mean, operationally, are there mechanisms that ASEAN can come up with and work with at this time? And also, Vietnam, as the chair, this is a big year for Vietnam, 2020, and we both know this very well. We've been to Vietnam to workshops. We have. I also want to note that we have partner institutes within the ASEAN ISIS institutes of think tanks in Vietnam, in all the ASEAN countries, and the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam has been at the forefront of the think tanks preparing Vietnam for the chairmanship. In addition, Vietnam is also a United Nations Security Council rotating member this year. This is a big year for Vietnam. But what else can be done at the ASEAN level for mechanisms and for concrete measures, Kunkawi, to deal with the COVID crisis, COVID-19? And then when you talk about that, and also go on to talk about a little bit about U.S.-China global not partnership, but ideally global partnership, but I think we might be seeing a different kind of global leadership emerging. Is this the case? And after you say something about that, I'll have a bit to say about that as well. Please go ahead.
Well, I think at the moment, ASEAN countries have done what they call real-time exchange of information. A lot of things have been going on that we don't know. You have mentioned some of the cross-border grid. Yes, I think it happened, but now I think it has been settled because there's more information exchange, and this is very important because in the beginning, ASEAN do not have the kind of mechanism, for example, to cooperate on the shutting down of borders. They don't have that. I think these are the things that in the futures ASEAN have to discuss. And in the futures, you will have also respond to COVID-19 or respond to a pandemic fund. I think they are working on this is something new and something very important. Regarding the role of China, the leading role of China vis-a-vis the United States, this will be a big issue that will be debated for decades. And I think both countries will continue to play a leadership role. At the moment, of course, China will have an edge on public health, particularly in combating the COVID-19. But Southeast Asian regions also need American leaderships in providing the securities and other issues. So you have to think of the futures that China might be take the lead in certain issue. United States might be able to take the lead at the certain issue, and at the same time, there will be a common issue that both can work out together. For example, like climate change. And I think COVID-19 pandemic will allow China and also United States, including other dialogue partners, to work together, because ASEAN can provide venues Dr. Surin Pisuwan, our former Secretary General, would like to say that ASEAN is a fulcrum where major power get together and work out their idea. They feel very comfortable to come to ASEAN. And I think that is still number one virtue, no matter what issue you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. The ASEAN mechanisms for cooperation, Kun Kavi, this is something that I think there's been some scrutiny, and many people wish and look forward to more that ASEAN can do for the ASEAN member states, right? So COVID-19 is a clear and present crisis. It is here and now. So some measures and mechanisms would have to be very speedy. It has to be fast. It cannot, wait for the different senior officials and leaders to talk and then have some statement and communicate. It has to be very fast. It has to be here and now. So I'm just thinking the think tanks of Southeast Asia, of ASEAN, I mentioned the different institutes, think tanks around the region. Recently, we had a consultation, and we have come up with some recommendations for the ASEAN leaders, ASEAN governments, Kun Kavi. And you know all these think tanks because we both work with think tanks in Southeast Asia and beyond. This effort was led this year. The chair of the ASEAN ISIS think tanks is the Singapore Institute for International Affairs. So they took a leading role and came up with a draft, and we kind of all made some modifications and agree with it. It's been forwarded to the ASEAN government, so I hope that they will have a look at it, and I hope that they will at least consider some of the recommendations. I'll just mention one, and this has been vetted around the think tanks in the region. Supply chains have been disrupted. And, we make a lot of stuff in Southeast Asia, Kun Kavi. People think of China as a factory of the world. It's true. China has been a factory of the world, but Southeast Asia, ASEAN, also has been a major factory and market for global value chains as well. So one recommendation that we have had is to convert some of these productive facilities to make medical test kits for COVID-19, for example. You can see in Thailand, in other countries, and in the world, there's been overnight conversions of production into alcohol, for example. Test kits will be another one. So I think that maybe there's a way to, in short order, without going through long processes and bureaucratic procedures, I wonder if something can be done so that ASEAN can start to convert some of the supply chains that are still working to making, test kits for COVID-19. That would be something concrete. We're looking at something concrete, fast, immediate to address this clear and present danger and crisis. So that's an example. On the U.S.-China, Kun Kavi, I mentioned, the ideal situation would be a U.S.-China global partnership, right? The U.S. has world-renowned, medical industry expertise. They have the best universities in the world. They have the best medical schools in the world, and so on. The best doctors, and so on. They have a lot of Nobel Prize winners in medicine, and they have the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta. So the wherewithal of the United States is immense. But China also, we know less about China because China is not an open system, but by evidence, we can see that China has contained and stabilized its COVID situation, and it has a lot of experience to offer. In addition to medical supplies, China has been flying planes with supplies to all kinds of countries. So the ideal situation would be a U.S.-China global partnership to overcome the COVID crisis. But we're not seeing that. President Trump has been a bit ambivalent. So sometimes initially he called, of course, the coronavirus Chinese virus, but he's backed off that narrative, it seems. And then more recently, he seems to want to cooperate a little bit, welcoming China's role in the world to address COVID-19. So we don't really know. I mean, if the U.S. Administration is intent on working with China very closely or not. But the onus, I think, now is on the United States, because it's clear that China is reaching out. And if you receive, then China engages. We can see this in Southeast Asia, flies to Laos, Cambodia, Thailand also receiving some all around the region, and in European countries as well. So the onus on the U.S. is, what do they think of China? And here, I think this is where the rivalry and competition play into it. The Trump administration and the U.S. Broader U.S. Electorate, I think, is taking a bit of a skeptical view of China, and we can see this narrative questioning China's handling of the COVID crisis, even questioning the source of the virus and the direction of the virus handling, and China's deep intentions for the world. So this is a kind of narrative in the United States. So I think we are seeing more, not global partnership, but the intensification of the geopolitical rivalry and competition. And this gets into the leadership issue. The COVID crisis, I think, is exposing, revealing, or showing leadership dynamics. China is really asserting itself now, and the U.S. is, the U.S. not behind, or not somewhat behind, but not abandoning its role per se. But I think it has so many issues to deal with at home, apart from the COVID-19, the election coming up, and many other problems. So this could be the moment, Kun Kavi, this could be the COVID moment for global leadership. And China is showing itself in that direction, whereas the United States might be a bit behind the curve here. What would you say to this? And after you make a short response, I'm going to maybe imagine a digital show of hands, and I'll go back to the questions and comments. So please go ahead.
Well, I think in the end, ASEAN will have to play, again, as I said, a bridging sort of roles to draw in both United States and China. We don't want to see both countries compete over our turf, because we will suffer. So I think it's important that ASEAN will draw in the expertise. As you mentioned, the United States want to have great doctors, great university, and all time things. And America and China now has shown that it's also has competitive capacity, especially in fighting COVID-19. So I think in the future, you will see more of the so-called third-party partnership, something that ASEAN will put itself in between so that it can draw in United States. As we often mention that we will never choose sides, because we want both, because they are superpower and they're both good for our region.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go over a few comments and questions now. I mean, we have Dr. Apishai Sanchinda pointing out that ASEAN has just released the ASEAN policy brief on economic impact of COVID outbreak on ASEAN. I'm not sure if ASEAN released that or Dr. Apishai Sanchinda has done that, but that's the point. There's something of an economic impact of COVID outbreak. Eduardo Pedrosa asked about EAS, not just ASEAN Plus 3, but I think we've talked about the East Asia Summit already to some extent. I'll just take this question now from Ambassador Pasapon, who is the Thai ambassador in Jakarta. She raised a few issues, but the question that I think relevant to us that we have not touched, Kun Kavi, is the role of the ASEAN Secretary General and the ASEAN Secretariat at this time. So let's take that one on board. Ambassador of Spain in Bangkok, Ambassador Emilio de Miguel de Calaba said, how do you think this crisis may affect relations between EU and ASEAN? So let's take that as a second question on board, Khun Kavi. EU-ASEAN relations in context of COVID-19. Is this crisis affecting strongly the image of EU in ASEAN? Would this diminish the EU's role in ASEAN? A question from Paul Stevens, the number 2 deputy head of mission at the Australian Embassy in Bangkok. Major powers are seeking to gain strategic advantage from the COVID-19 crisis through enhanced and aid packages and messaging. Do you see COVID-19 accelerating the move of ASEAN countries more quickly and closely into the orbit of one major power? To some extent, I think that we have addressed that, and that he's being diplomatic. Of course, we said that it was China. COVID-19 is weakening globalization as countries erect walls and the trend to protectionism strengthens. Will this make regional organizations like ASEAN less relevant? How do we safeguard the gains of globalization? Okay, I think we have enough on the plate just for this round. We still have a bit of time. EU-ASEAN, Khun Kavi, the role of ASEAN Secretary General, the ASEAN Secretariat, and the third would be, is globalization being undermined now, with the COVID crisis within ASEAN context?
Well, it's all very good questions. I would answer the first question, the role of ASEAN Secretary General and also ASEAN Sec. I wish ASEAN Secretary General could do more. In the past few years, you have seen the role of ASEAN Secretary General increase, especially due to the crisis that ASEAN faced. For example, during the Nargis crisis in 2008, Dr. Surin has been active. Now, during the Rakhine crisis, Secretary General, current one, has given extra mandate last year by the Thai chairmanship so that he can initiate, take fact-finding, work closely with other ASEAN members and Myanmar. This is the role that ASEAN Secretary General has been doing. And I have to thanks also to Passport, our CPR Thai, who has been active, liaised cooperations between various ASEAN department and Thailand last year. And I think in the future, the role of ASEAN Secretary General must be broadened. He must be given the mandate to respond quickly to crisis. In the past, ASEAN Secretary General could not move, could not do anything without the permission of the foreign minister. Now he has the mandate. He can make his own decisions and move into the crisis area. I think that's the role. And there are a lot more can say about ASEAN Secretariat, but I think these will take a long time to discuss. Number 2, ASEAN-EU relation is very problematic because you have a lot of issue on top of other issue. As a regional organization, EU is the #1 most important dialogue partner of ASEAN with EU. But somehow, when it comes to working relation, ASEAN member could not work out a kind of consensus that will allow EU as an organization to jump in. For example, we wanted to have EU as a strategic dialogue partner. We failed because of the disagreements, lack of consensus amongst certain ASEAN members over certain issue. That caused a lot of problem because EU is very important, particularly at this particular juncture. EU need friends in the region, and ASEAN also need friends in the EU. And regarding COVID-19, there are a lot of things that EU can do, but I think EU was a little bit late in approaching ASEAN. I think there have been some meeting just a few weeks ago, and I think in the future, ASEAN need to work with EU member more discreetly, particularly on the rights issue. If it's continue like this, it will be very difficult because the ASEAN need EU, but it gets stuck. One of the oldest dialogue partner still could not do it ex mode to promote the relations. And the last questions, I don't think so. And this is a very good question. A lot of people have asked me that the COVID-19 will push ASEAN into the ambit of China. I don't think so, because ASEAN has been very careful in managing relation with China. And ASEAN know what is right to do, what is not right to do. Certainly, there were times when certain ASEAN countries must have their own policy action. But as a whole, when it comes to consensus, ASEAN centrality still hold. So I don't think COVID-19, as I think I have read some article that has been emerging this past 1 or 2 days, saying that it will push ASEAN into the China's influence. I don't think so. China influence toward ASEAN, of course, is always there because we share proximities. They are our very big trading partner, even though now it has been disrupted because of COVID-19. It will come back, and we still need investment from China, and China investment is coming in. So in the future, relations between China will be strengthened, but there will be still a lot of issues. ASEAN is very interesting when it deals with China. For example, China has proposed the idea of having ASEAN summit with China over COVID-19, but ASEAN has not yet accepted the idea. If really ASEAN is under China influence, ASEAN member will accept it. A lot of time, ASEAN think very hard. Second time, third time, regarding China initiative, it really serves China interest. ASEAN will take it. Of course, there are certain ASEAN member, due to their national interest and necessity, they certainly take in certain ASEAN initiative, but that is not ASEAN consensus.
Okay, thank you. I have a different take on the last one, but let me first say I was smiling a little bit earlier, Kun Kavi, because I'm delighted and amazed at this kind of public forum that we're having. Normally in person we would have maybe 120, 150 people, Kun Kavi, in a room, a nice room, and we'd have a very dynamic interaction, and that would be, that's how we do it. This time there's nobody in the room except me and you over there, but we have it's amazing, we have so many people from different parts of the world posing questions and comments. We couldn't do that in person. On the other hand, it's also nice in person to have a face-to-face kind of dialogue. You mentioned Rakhine. This is also one of the recommendations the ASEAN ISIS think tanks propose, and it's not any particular outcome to recommend, but it's really kind of a recommendation to keep an extra eye, a heightened spotlight and attention to Rakhine, to the westernmost regions of Myanmar. We have the situation with the Rohingya people in the borders with Bangladesh. This is a million people in squalid camps along the border, very poor conditions, COVID crisis, the COVID-19 could really strike that part of ASEAN. And already we know that Rakhine has been a major issue for ASEAN vis-a-vis the outside world and also within ASEAN. So Rakhine warrants extra spotlight, immediate attention. So because we do not want to see COVID-19 ravaging that entire area. You mentioned the ASEAN SecGen. I have written, I've taken a very different view on the ASEAN Secretary General post. I think it should not be a rotating post. We don't hear much. I mean, the ASEAN Secretary General, with all due respect, where is he? What is he saying about COVID-19? He should be at the forefront. We had the late Surin Pisawan setting the benchmark for us being an ASEAN Secretary General because he was a spokesperson. He was the face of ASEAN, not just within the region or Asia, but in the world. But that was particular, that was confined and specific to his attributes and his charisma, his own credentials and background, everything. And we have this rotating ASEAN Secretary General through the different countries. And I think that, sometimes very effective, sometimes never heard from, hardly noticeable. And I personally, have the view that we should make the ASEAN Secretary General position open to the best qualified candidates, not just rotational among the different ASEAN member states. The EU, I think this is a good question and a very valid, understandable concern from the Spanish ambassador in Bangkok. EU is having a hard time with COVID-19. And we see numbers in Italy. We also see numbers in Spain. The curve, if you look on the chart, is very much upward sloping. That is very steep slope. The death toll, the infections. So I think for EU-ASEAN relations in relation to COVID-19, it will be consequential. I think for ASEAN is here for EU engagement. I think the bigger question will be whether the EU, what kind of a shape and form the EU will re-emerge post-COVID-19 to re-engage with ASEAN. So as long as the EU is prepared and in position, I think ASEAN is here. But if EU is weakened by COVID-19, then I think we will see a bit more drift between EU and ASEAN, because ASEAN will be looking for countries and regions that can promote, that can do business with ASEAN, that can fulfill what ASEAN is looking for. On globalization, I think this is a very consequential issue. Borders are going up. I mean, this is an amazing time, Khun Kavi. Every day during this lockdown period in Thailand, and since my university is closed, and since early March, I am in a kind of a sustained and prolonged disbelief. Every day I point to myself, I cannot believe this is happening to the world. I cannot believe that borders have come up so high. The different nationals of different countries have gone home more than ever. This is a time where I think there are fewest nationals outside their home countries than ever. I mean, airlines are down. There's no airtime for airlines. Airports are empty. Every day I just cannot believe this is happening. But for globalization, I think the trend will be that it will be less globalized, but we will see more localized and more regionalized. Certainly, a lot of multinationals will be thinking about supply chains. They'll be thinking, should we be so far away? I mean, can we be making things in China with all these issues and trade friction and the distrust and everything? So I think we will see certainly some reshoring. We're seeing some of that already. But I think for ASEAN, we will see more regionalization. Japan, China, South Korea, even Taiwan, to an extent, they may make more things around us, Khun Kavi. And I think this is also for the ASEAN economies too. actually Thailand and some ASEAN economies, we have multinationals from Southeast Asia with presence in North America, in Latin America, all over the world. But I think now with COVID-19, which I think will be haunting for some months, many months, maybe some years, the supply chain effect will be that it will come home more. It will be in a neighborhood more. So home and neighborhood probably more than further away, and therefore I think globalization as we know it, as we have known it, will not be the same. Let's take questions and comments again. We have one here from our colleague, Gwen Robinson, the president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, but also senior fellow with ISIS Thailand. She has a question, Kun Kavi, about the FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific strategy. When you say strategy, I think it's more associated with the United States, US-led FOIP, and China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Both countries are going to be hit hard economically. How are they going to meet spending commitments? I take it that this question has to do with what happens now, Kun Kavi, and I'll have something to say about this, to FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, US-led, and China-led Belt and Road Initiative. Given that both the Chinese and US economies will be hit hard by the COVID crisis. I mean, China, we're looking at certainly China will not have 6% growth as projected earlier. We're looking at a recession in China, deep contraction in second quarter Chinese economy, and maybe for the entire year of 2020, China would be lucky to register 2 or 3% growth. US, we're looking at contraction, certainly first half of 2020. For the entire year, some kind of recession will be minus growth, it will be some contraction. This will be consequential for the US, Free and Open Indo-Pacific FOIP strategy, and also China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm just wondering, what the Chinese people, they might not have a big appetite for spending a lot of money on Belt and Road when they have when they need a lot of money at home. What do you think, Kun Kavi?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think both China and America will slow down, including the Indo-Pacific strategy, and in the case of China BRI. This allows ASEAN a great opportunity to promote Indo-Pacific. Now, there are a few things that ASEAN has to do. We have to make sure that our trade regime is free, that our investments among ASEAN countries has increased, trade facilitation. And in fact, I would argue, maybe nobody will support me, that ASEAN outlook for the Indo-Pacific can represent a recovery plan if we do it right. Indonesia want to hold a meeting in June to mobilize investment. Now it's not possible. Now we have to look into ourselves, particularly on the PPP. It's very important because ASEAN has been looking at various projects all along that related to connectivity. So this is a good time for ASEAN to have a soul-searching, cooperate among themselves because they face common problems. And this, I think, is a good opportunity. And then we can wait until the recovery from the bigger investor, United States, and also China. That is my answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a number of questions and comments here. Let's take a couple more on the BRI and FOIP. Kun Kavi, I would just add. I mean, from my perspective, there will be a recalibration of BRI. I think that President Xi Jinping will have a lot to answer for. I think that some Chinese people are not happy with the way that the COVID crisis was handled in the beginning, but I think that they, relative to the outside world, they're probably seeing that China has come around it, has kind of turned around, and maybe President Xi will be kind of overlooked for the earlier mishap and mishandling. But medium term, longer term, the Chinese economy will be looking at different priorities. It doesn't mean, I don't think the Belt and Road will not be abandoned, but it will be recalibrated. And also the recipient countries along the Belt and Road, they also will be hard hit by this COVID crisis. And therefore, their own appetite for Belt and Road projects will also shift. So BRI will be maintained but recalibrated, both by China and also, I think, among the recipient countries. FOIP, I think, is on hold now because it's not like the meetings will stop. They will have the different meetings. They still have a lot of diplomats behind it. But if you look at the U.S., the Trump administration is preoccupied with many other issues. There's a whole COVID-19 crisis in the country. Infections are going up, death toll going up, and they're just trying to get a grip on COVID. So this is going to get into the middle of 2020, and they have the election coming up in November. It's going to be very contentious, and President Trump up against most likely, it seems, will be Joe Biden or the Democratic Party. So the U.S. this year not in a great position to be leading and projecting FOIP. I think this year geopolitics, geoeconomics will be dominated by COVID-19 and how different countries come to terms with COVID-19 and how different countries re-emerge into a new kind of normal, in what shape, in different shapes and different forms. This will also realign, I think, the pecking order to some extent among the various international players, including the major powers. I want to take a couple of questions now from long-time ASEAN experts and professionals. One from Professor Anne-Marie Murphy in New York. Partly, we set this time, when I was looking at the time, having 9:30 in the morning in Thailand is our usual time, but it doesn't catch our European viewers, but it catches New York at roughly the same time, but 12 hours behind at nighttime. So I welcome this input now from Professor Anne-Marie Murphy. To what extent ASEAN countries blame China for the start and early mishandling of the COVID crisis, like President Trump is doing in the US. And then in the early stages of the pandemic, China strongly opposed the actions of some ASEAN countries to limit travel by Chinese citizens and otherwise adopt policies I disagreed with. To what extent are such sentiments still prevalent in ASEAN, or have they dissipated? So, two questions from Anne-Marie Murphy. Early handling of pandemic, of COVID, does ASEAN blame China? And then, ASEAN countries now, China strongly opposed some actions of the ASEAN countries early on, but have things normalized. ASEAN China, despite earlier skepticism and criticism, are they back on the same page now? Second, from Ambassador Sriya Jindawong in Singapore, very useful and dynamic discussion, looking to the long term. For the long term, how do you see the current pandemic challenge realigning ASEAN and ASEAN Plus policy priorities in the future? So ASEAN priorities in the future, to what extent COVID pandemic affects ASEAN's policy directions? One question from Ambassador Sriya Jindawong. From Anne-Marie Murphy, I think basically ASEAN-China, everything back to normal on the same page despite early problems in January, February. Khun Kavi.
Well, thank you for the questions. My first answer is this. ASEAN members have different response toward China in the earlier spread of COVID-19. As you can see, Thailand, Cambodia have not yet stopped the Chinese at all because they want tourism to come in. And if you read all ASEAN statement, ASEAN alluded to the WHO statement that traveling should not be restricted. I don't think any country have blamed China for that. Once they know after the incidents from Wuhan, then certain countries react quickly. For example, Singapore banned, and then later on Thailand. So I think slowly all the ASEAN members adjust to this. I don't think any country have blamed China for that. And that is why ASEAN foreign minister and China foreign minister were able to meet quickly in the first week of February in Vientiane. That explained to you how fast they move. At the time, there's no dialogue exists between the United States and EU. Secondly, I think after the COVID-19, the priority of ASEAN will be focused on the well-being of the citizen of ASEAN. And I think the third pillar on the cultural and social pillar must be improved, particularly how to improve the social safety net of all ASEAN countries. I think this is one of the important issues. For example, you probably have to come out with some insurance scheme for the future so that ASEAN member will work together as a whole. This is something that I think must come up in the futures.
Okay, thank you very much. Kunduwi, I'm going to wrap this up. You can have the last word. So if you want to say something very briefly at the end, you're welcome to. We are up to time. I don't want to go over time too much. We'll just take a couple more minutes. I also want to apologize for some of the viewers that some questions and comments, we cannot take them all. There was a question about whether ASEAN will survive all of this. I think it will for sure survive all of this. In what shape and form is something else that we can answer, we can talk about. I think that for Anne-Marie Murphy's questions about whether ASEAN and China back in the same space now, even early in the COVID crisis, there were different ASEAN responses. I see that early phase as a kind of do you suffer with China or do you suffer against China? So some countries suffered against China by imposing immediate restrictions, air travel and flights and so on, and we can see some of those countries earlier. But countries that suffered with China, I think at the forefront has to be Cambodia. Prime Minister Hun Sen went to China early February, maybe in February 6th or so, and there was a meeting in Laos, in Vientiane, the foreign ministers meeting, and I think that Thailand also did not suspend the Wuhan flights from Wuhan in Hebei province until 2 weeks after the outbreak was known widely. And the first infection of COVID-19 outside China was in Thailand. I think it was sometime in January 13 or 16 or something like that. And despite that, the flights continued for some time. So Thailand was very lenient, very accommodating. I think Cambodia, Laos, certainly. Other countries imposed restrictions early on, including, I think, Singapore, Indonesia, I think. So even early on, the responses were mixed. I think by this time, there's still, overall by this time, different countries, as more countries in ASEAN and the world are having to get a grip or come to terms and grapple with the COVID-19, they welcome help. I think that, who would turn away face masks if they work well? If face masks or test kits, and these are desperately needed. So if China is providing that, I think the ASEAN countries will be happy to receive them. I think now there's been a turnaround. Even the countries that impose restrictions early on are coming around. How do you turn away aid and help from China or Japan or any other country. That's one. Future directions of ASEAN, I think it really depends. I think COVID-19 should be taken as an opportunity. It's a crisis, but it can also be a wake-up call for ASEAN to see where gaps exist, where they need to coordinate closer. They have to be faster. For sure, one lesson for me for ASEAN in this pandemic period is that you can't go around and wait days on end for a statement, for a position. There has to be some mechanism that can be accelerated. There has to be a shortcut for a crisis like COVID-19, fast track approach. And then I want to make a correction that the earlier policy brief was from the ASEAN Secretariat, not Dr. Abhishai. He made a point of that. Other than that, there are more issues to discuss, more questions and comments, and I'm sorry we cannot take them all. I want to bring this to a close because we set a time for 9:30 to 11 a.m. This is a kind of an imagined public forum. Kunkavi, if you can take that analogy and metaphor, the imagined community, but this is an imagined ISIS Thailand public forum. I think it's worked well so far, and any technical glitches, I deeply apologize. Kunkavi, you can have the last word if you want to say anything else, and then we'll call it the show for now, for today.
Well, I'm sure ASEAN will survive. It will be more cohesive and responsive to use the logo of Vietnam Chairmanship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all viewers from different parts of the world, especially in Thailand. I hope this has been. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope this has been fruitful and useful. And we will have more of it. Next Friday, I'll have Dr. Panitan Watanayakon, and we'll be talking about the emergency decree in Thailand, the lockdown, and afterwards. And after that, we'll be looking at the Thai economy, Thai politics in the context of COVID-19. So thank you very much for joining us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
สวัสดีครับ